Good morning, First Parish in Cambridge. My name is Reverend Becky Sheble-Hall, and I'm your pastoral care minister while Reverend Adam is away these next few months. I also get the privilege of offering you a morning message once a month, and that's what this is. So when I was a little girl, maybe about 6, and my brother was about 10, I used to drive him nutty every time we played card games. Just your cards, Becky, he'd say. I can see them all. I understand looking back his frustration at that because my brother could sit still and focus on a game really well. And he loved that. And he was hoping for a little bit of a challenge from me. So he had taught me carefully how to put the cards in your hand and fan them out like that. And if you had too many cards, you could use 2 hands and use your thumbs here to hold the cards. But because I had the attention of a butterfly, sometimes keeping those cards together was really difficult for me. Like if I needed to pick a card from his hand, I had to put all of them into one hand, squish, and quickly grab from his, and then how to find the room in my hands of cards for the new cards, that was difficult. And my attention would wander, and slowly the cards in my hand would begin to fall down like a drawbridge on a castle, and I'd hear, "Just your cards." So I shared this memory with you this morning because for some strange reason, this is the image my mind went to when I read the theme of November's Soul Matters curriculum, Holding History. I've been thinking that some of us, especially those of us of a certain age, those of us who get privileged in the telling of our national history, whose ancestors' achievements get highlighted in that story, we tend to hold that history close to our chest. It's ours. It's what we learned in school. We don't necessarily want people looking at it, poking around in there as the national conversation is doing these days. History has been taught in a linear fashion for generations. Think of all those timelines we memorized. First, this happened, and then that happened, and this event served as the foundation for the next one. History is either stagnant and you can't change it. The only way that history moves is forward, or so we thought. But the events of recent years compel us to see history differently. The Black Lives Matter movement and the racist violence it responds to, the pandemic and the inequities it spotlights make it impossible to pretend that our written national history is inclusive, much less accurate. We're being forced to acknowledge that traditional history was written through the lens of the most privileged members of our society. And therefore, those timelines we memorize have huge gaps, voices that were silenced, and groups of people made invisible. These days, it seems clear that we need to revisit our history, going back so that we can continue forward. Instead of a linear line, maybe we can re-envision our history as a web of connections, seeing how each group of people influenced another for good or for bad. What would it look like to centralize the stories of those we have marginalized, and to tell those stories fully, not as stereotypes of pity and suffering, but to include the ingenuity and the resilience of those same people? This would require a loosening of our hold on history. I, for one, am eager to do so, and so must any of you who did not see the ancestors with whom you identify fully present in the history you studied. One ramification of this loosening process is the toppling of statues. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, in 2020, the year that George Floyd was murdered by a Minneapolis police officer, close to 100 statues representing Confederate and racist heroes were toppled by protesters or taken down intentionally by local governments. And really, all of that must have happened in 7 months since George Floyd was killed in May of that year. Statue of Confederate icons such as Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and even Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner himself, were torn down by protesters in incidents across our country. In some places, governments intentionally removed similarly offensive memorials, but not to worry. According to the same report, there are at least 700 such monuments left standing in the South alone. Still, their removal raised a ruckus among conservatives and white supremacists, especially in the South. People were angry with what they saw as an attempt to change history, as if only that was possible, right? Just 1 month after Floyd's murder that year, then President Trump tweeted out this doozy, clearly aimed at the fears of the white supremacist voters he was courting. They want to demolish our heritage, he said, so that they can impose a new oppressive regime in its place. Really? I've got some questions, don't you? Like, who is they? And whose heritage is our heritage? And please define oppressive in this situation, because some might see that taking down of memorials to slavery is actually liberating and not oppressive. But let's not scapegoat Trump here, as easy as that would be. Many, many voices joined him. We hear them still in the media, on conservative talk shows. Perhaps it comes up in conversations you have with relatives or friends down south. It feels like a ripping of their history to some, and that's real for them. But I'd rather lift up the voices of those who feel a multi-generational relief as those symbols of violent white supremacy are cast down from their pedestals. Googling for those voices brought me great joy. And if you're looking for a little of that, I highly recommend an article in The Guardian from last September. There's even a little video there taken at the State House in Richmond, Virginia, with Robert E. Lee and his horse hanging by a rope in the air as an elated crowd whooped and hollered and chanted, "The people united will never be defeated." Later, Lee's torso was sawed off his horse and thrown in the back of a flatbed. It's been very difficult to see symbols glorifying people who brought my ancestors here literally in chains, said one woman witnessing the event. Another person in a crowd, a Black man who had been tear gassed and arrested at protests leading up to this event, had this to say about that statue in his hometown. It represented that the descendants of plantation owners are still the ones in power. The fact that it's removed, this neighborhood is going to be safer. Our world is going to be safer. And it wasn't only the symbols of the Confederacy that met their demise in 2020. Closer to home, in Boston's North End, the statue of Christopher Columbus was beheaded by protesters one night. Its remains are now in storage someplace. For the Italian Americans who supported and funded the statue in 1979, Christopher Columbus discovered America, and it's a source of pride for them. But to the original people of this land, Christopher Columbus was an invader whose arrival initiated a long and factual history of violence and extermination against them. Thanksgiving, when it honors the Pilgrims' arrival on the Mayflower, has a similar effect. So self-reflection is the only way to re-envision our history. So I must tell you, I feel great remorse in my participation in these historical myths. How many of us had parts in those elementary school plays where we sang, in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I was an ocean wave in first grade, walking across the stage, rocking my piece of blue cardboard. Not only that, I made similar props for my children's Christopher Columbus Day plays. Okay, yes, those events happened decades ago, and I have an understanding of that history now. But still, I cherish the memories of those plays. Thanksgiving is still one of my favorite family holidays. How can I hold those attachments and still honor the suffering of those first peoples and the continued stifling and sorrow of their descendants? This is where I feel like testing my cards. Can't I just pretend that that history is okay? No. So one sermon doesn't detangle a lifetime of racism and mythology, though again, we ministers tend to write the sermons we need to hear. What do we know is true? We know that statues are not history. They represent the values we hold. We know that finally, more and more of us are saying no to the value of white supremacy in our past, in our present, and most importantly, in our future. We know that we need to decentralize the white Europeans in the Thanksgiving Day story. Perhaps we can focus on the earth-based blessing of the harvest at our table and the gathering of the loved ones. Maybe we can honor the courage it takes to welcome the stranger with compassion, as those first people did. Then we might be making steps towards re-envisioning a holiday we can all celebrate. And what do we do with Christopher Columbus Day? Some have called for a day of mourning. I like that in some places it has been renamed Indigenous People Day. Hopefully, it includes both the mourning with and the celebrating of Native Americans. I wonder what our children will learn in school if they can do that very complicated storytelling well there. I'd love to make props for those plays. Friends, as adults, we look back at our personal history, often seeing things differently than we did as a child. Blame and shame can shift. This new understanding helps us to grow. We need to do this hard work as a nation. Let us loosen our hold on history. Let us find space for new cards in the hands we are holding. May you see your story reflected and honored there. May all people be so blessed. Amen.